Guys, in this video we're going to have a look at GCSE English Literature. We're focusing on power and conflict poetry. The poem we're going to focus on here is Storm on the Island, written by Seamus Heaney. So it was written in 1966, and the first 8 letters of the title spell Stormont, the name of Northern Ireland's parliament, suggesting that the poem is a metaphor for political conflict, such as the Troubles. It's based on a community living in a sturdy stone cottage on a cliffside, hunkering down to survive a violent gale hitting the island. The main message of the poem is that nature is an unstoppable, indifferent force that makes human preparation look small. It also shows how people can become hardened to constant conflict. The tame cat turned savage and huge nothing in the quotes symbolize how the familiar world can suddenly become a deadly enemy, and how fear is often directed at an invisible, intangible power. So, the key ideas for the poem are man versus nature, as the islanders are in a constant battle with elements. Nature is personified as a calculated military attacker. Another idea is the power of fear, because the ending suggests that fear is a psychological burden caused by a huge nothing. The wind is invisible, making it more terrifying. There's also the idea of isolation and community, because the use of we shows a collective strength, but the lack of trees or company means they must face the storm alone. Political metaphor is also shown because the storm represents the troubles in Northern Ireland, where the invisible threat of violence was a constant part of daily life. Let's have a look at the structure of the poem. So it's written in blank verse, where it has unrhymed iambic pentameter. The steady conversational rhythm mimics natural speech, suggesting that enjoying these storms is a natural everyday part of life. It has written in one long stanza, so the dense block of the text reflects the squat houses and the solid wall community. There are no breaks, just like there is no break from the storm. Enjambment is used, so the sentences spill over the lines, creating a sense of the wind's constant rushing movement and the lack of control that the islanders have. There's also a cyclical shift, so it starts with the confidence of being prepared, but ends with the admission of fear, showing nature's power to break human spirit. Let's have a look at the context of the poem. So, it's based on the Northern Ireland Troubles, like we said before, so the title is a pun of Stormont, the seat of the Northern Irish government. The storm serves as a metaphor for the political and sectarian violence that plagued the region for decades. It looks at Heaney's Irish heritage, so as a Northern Irish poet, Heaney often wrote about the land, rural life, and the connection between the landscape and the people's identity. It looks at humanity versus the elements, so Heaney explores the stoicism of island life. Like the Romantic poets, he acknowledges nature's awesome power, but he focuses more on the gritty, practical struggle of surviving it. It looks at the concept of the not known, so the poem reflects the anxiety of facing an invisible enemy. In a storm, it's the wind. In a political conflict, it's the constant, unseen threat of an explosion or attack. Let's have a look at the actual poem. So here's the poem. You're more than welcome to pause the video, have a little read, and press play when you're ready. Let's do a line-by-line analysis. So, we are prepared. We build our houses squat. We are prepared is a strong, confident opening, and the caesura, with the colon is, creates a pause that reinforces a sense of readiness and stability. Squat suggests the houses are low to the ground and sturdy, built specifically to resist the wind. It shows a community that has adapted to a hostile environment. Sink walls in rock and roof them with good slate. This wizened earth has never troubled us. Sink walls in rock shows verbs like sink suggest permanent, deep foundations. Wizened earth is personification, and wizened suggests that the land is like an old, shriveled face. It implies that the land is barren and tough, but also that the islanders have a long-standing relationship with it. With hay, so as you can see, there are no stacks or stucks that can be lost. No stacks or stucks show that the island is so harsh that they cannot grow crops. Ironically, it is a benefit during a storm because there is nothing for the wind to blow away or destroy. Nor are there trees, which might prove company when it blows full blast. Company is personification, and the absence of trees emphasizes the islander's isolation. There is no natural life to share the experience with them. Blast, the plosive B sound and the colon create a sudden, forceful pause, mimicking the impact of a gust of wind. You know what I mean. Leaves and branches can raise a tragic chorus in a gale. You know what I mean has a conversational colloquial aside. It makes the poem feel like a direct address to the reader, drawing them into the experience. Tragic chorus is a metaphor and an allusion to Greek tragedy, as it suggests the sound of the wind in the trees is like a group of singers mourning a disaster. Forgetting that it pummels your house too, but there are no trees, no natural shelter. Pummels is a violent physical verb. It personifies the wind as a boxer or an attacker, showing its aggressive intent. No natural shelter reinforces vulnerability of the islanders. They only have what they have built themselves. You might think that the sea is company, exploding comfortably down on the cliffs. Exploding comfortably is a striking oxymoron. It suggests that the islanders are so used to the violent sound of the waves that it has become familiar and even soothing to them until the storm truly begins. But no, when it begins, the flung spray hits the very windows, spits like a tame cat turned savage. Spits like a tame cat turned savage is a vivid simile. It shows how nature can switch from being domestic and predictable to being wild and dangerous in an instant. The enjambment between the lines reflects a sudden change. We just sit tight while wind dives and strafes invisibly. Dives and strafes are military metaphors, language of war. It describes the wind as a fighter jet attacking from the sky. Invisibly emphasizes the psychological terror, as you cannot see the enemy that is attacking you. Space is a salvo. We are bombarded by the empty air. Salvo and bombarded are further military metaphors. A salvo is a simultaneous discharge of weapons, and the islanders are under siege by a force that has no physical form. Strange, it is a huge nothing that we fear. Huge nothing is an oxymoron that concludes the poem. It highlights the irony that after all their physical preparation, squat houses and slave fruits, they thing that they fear is invisible and intangible, the wind. This reflects the psychological nature of fear and political tension. So let's do a section by section analysis. Lines 1 to 10 look at the physical environment. What happens is the speaker describes the community's preparation, building squat houses on a barren, wizened island where no crops or trees can grow. The effect of this is that the tone is stoic and practical. The lack of trees and hay means there is nothing for the wind to destroy, but it also means there is no company or natural shelter. The islanders are isolated and must rely entirely on their own strength and stone walls. Techniques to highlight are collective pronouns we, personification in wizened earth, and plosives in blast and build. Lines 11 to 15, the deceptive sea. What happens here is the storm begins to pick up. The sea, which usually feels like company, becomes violent, with spray hitting the windows. Effect of this is that this section highlights the unpredictability of nature, the familiar landscape turns hostile, and the sounds that usually offer comfort, such as the sea, become threatening. The islanders realize they are not as safe as they thought. Techniques here are the oxymoron in exploding comfortably, simile, spits like a tame cat turned savage, and sibilance in the words spits, savage, and sit. Lines 16 to 19 are the invisible attack. So what happens is the wind strafes the house like a fighter jet, and the islanders hunker down, realizing they are being attacked by empty air. The effect of this is that the language shifts entirely to military metaphors, turning the weather into a deliberate enemy. The ending is ironic and philosophical. Despite their physical walls, the true storm is a psychological fear of an invisible, intangible force. Techniques to highlight are the military metaphors, strafes, salvo, bombarded, and the oxymoron in huge nothing and irony. Let's have a look at doing an overall interpretation. So, Seamus Heaney's Storm on the Island explores the fragile relationship between humanity and the overwhelming power of nature. Through a stoic conversational tone and aggressive military metaphors, the poem depicts a community that is physically prepared for a storm, but remains psychologically vulnerable to its invisible force. The poem suggests that nature is an indifferent, savage attacker that strips away human confidence. By the end, the oxymoron of a huge nothing reveals that the true conflict is internal, the fear of an unseen, intangible threat. Whether read as a literal storm or a metaphor for the political troubles in Northern Ireland, the poem highlights how constant conflict hardens a people and turns a very environment into a battlefield. Comparison checklist for essays. So if we're using this poem in our essay, we have to look at these points. Nature as an aggressor. So nature is not just weather, it is a personified military force that pummels and bombards. Stoicism and survival. So the squat houses and sit tight attitude show a community hardened by constant conflict. The power of the invisible. So the huge nothing reflects how fear of the unknown or political tension is more powerful than physical threats. Isolation. So the lack of trees or natural shelter emphasizes that the islanders are alone in their struggle. Let's have a look with what poems you can compare Storm on the Island with. So we can compare it with Exposure. Similarities between Exposure and Storm on the Island are that nature is seen as the enemy. Both poems personify the weather as a deliberate military force that attacks humans, such as Bombarded by the Empty Air versus the Icy East Winds that Knife Us. They both look at the feeling of being under siege, so both depict groups of people trapped and waiting for an attack they cannot control, creating a sense of exhaustion and helplessness. They both look at the invisible threat, so in both of the poems there is no physical soldier to fight. The conflict is against the environment and the psychological fear it creates. Differences are the level of preparation. So Storm on the Island begins with the confidence of we are prepared, whereas Exposure shows soldiers who are totally vulnerable and dying from the cold. Another difference is the outcome. So Storm on the Island shows a community that survives by sitting tight and enduring, whereas Exposure is much bleaker, ending with the death of the soldiers, but nothing happens. Another poem we can compare it with is The Prelude. So similarities are the overwhelming power of nature, as both poems show nature as a force that can become suddenly savage or huge and mighty, dwarfing human importance. They also both look at the psychological impact, so both explore how an encounter with nature leaves a lasting mark on the mind, for example, huge nothing that we fear versus trouble to my dreams. The differences are the setting and scale. So the prelude is an individual's spiritual experience in a vast landscape, whereas Storm on the Island is a collective physical struggle within a small squat community. Another difference is the tone. So the prelude is epic and philosophical, while Storm on the Island is gritty, conversational, and focused on practical survival. Key quotes to revise for Storm on the Island. So these are the key quotes you have to revise if you want to use this poem in your exam. We are prepared, we build our houses squat, has a collective tone showing the community's history of enduring hardship and their initial confidence. Spits like a tin cat turned savage is a simile showing how nature can suddenly turn from something familiar into something dangerous and unpredictable. Space is a salvo. We are bombarded by the empty air is a military metaphor, showing nature is personified as the army attacking the islanders with invisible weapons. The sea is company, exploding comfortably down on the cliffs is oxymoron. Exploding comfortably shows how the islanders have become so used to violence that it has become normal. Strange, it is a huge nothing that we fear. It's irony, as the poem ends by highlighting that the source of their terror is invisible, much like political tension.